Welcome back to Plain Sight Docs. Yosemite National Park feels like one of the safest places in America. Families go there to relax, hike, take photos, and escape the stress of everyday life. Surrounded by rangers, busy lodges, and the beauty of giant cliffs and waterfalls, it feels protected, untouched by the dangers we expect in the outside world. But in 1999, that sense of safety was shattered. This isn't a story of wild animals or deadly terrain. It's about a human predator who used Yosemite's peaceful image as the perfect camouflage. He didn't hide in the forest. He worked among tourists. He fixed leaky sinks. He carried a master key. He blended in so perfectly that no one ever questioned him. In February, 3 visitors, Carole Sund, her daughter Juli, and 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso, vanished from a quiet motel near the park. No struggle, no noise. Just a spotless room and 3 missing people. The FBI would search mountains, interrogate suspects, and chase the wrong killers, all while the real one walked freely among them. This is the true story of the Yosemite murders. If you enjoy true stories that are dark, mysterious, and hidden in plain sight, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell. February 1999. Yosemite National Park was in the grip of a deep, quiet winter. The summer crowds had long since vanished, leaving the valley floor covered in a pristine blanket of snow. It was a time when the park felt most like itself, ancient, silent, and indifferent to the few humans who ventured into its frozen heart. Into this serene landscape arrived 3 visitors looking for a winter adventure. Carole Sund, a 42-year-old dynamo, a woman, a successful businesswoman, and dedicated mother from Eureka, California. With her was her 15-year-old daughter Juli Sund, a vibrant, athletic high school cheerleader with her whole life ahead of her. And joining them was 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso, who was staying with the Sund family. Silvina had dreamed of seeing the grand American West, and this trip was meant to be the highlight of her stay. They were the picture of responsible, low-risk tourists. They weren't backcountry hikers taking foolish risks in avalanche territory. They stuck to the main, plowed roads. They stayed at the Cedar Lodge, a popular, well-lit motel complex located in El Portal, just outside the park's Arch Rock entrance. It was a standard tourist hub, busy even in winter, seemingly safe, surrounded by other travelers and staff. On the evening of February 15th, they did what thousands of tourists do every night. They ate a relaxed dinner at the lodge's restaurant, the Cedar House, enjoying burgers and casual conversation. Witnesses would later recall them laughing, normal. They rented a movie from the front desk, Sightings, a ghostly thriller, planning a cozy night in. They walked back to their room, room 509, a standard motel room facing the highway. And then, silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. They were scheduled to meet friends in Stockton the next day for the drive home. They never showed up. At first, there was no immediate panic. In 1999, before ubiquitous cell phones and constant GPS tracking, missed connections happened. Perhaps they had decided to stay another day, entranced by the fresh snowfall. Perhaps they had minor car trouble on one of the winding mountain roads outside Cell Range. But as hours turned into a full day, then 2, a cold knot of dread began to tighten in the stomachs of their families back home. Carole Sund was not the type of person to disappear. She was organized, responsible, a woman who checked in. Her husband, Jens Sund, knew in his gut that something was fundamentally wrong. He contacted the authorities. The initial police response was standard for a missing persons case in a vast wilderness area. Assume an accident. It happens every year. A car slides on an invisible patch of black ice, plunges down a steep, wooded embankment, into the churning Merced River and disappears from view. A hike goes wrong. Someone slips and they are lost in the woods. The massive search and rescue apparatus of Yosemite was mobilized. Helicopters equipped with infrared scanners flew grid patterns over the canyon roads, looking for skid marks, broken branches, or the glint of metal in the river. Ground teams on snowshoes hiked the trails they were known to have visited. Days turned into a week. The search area expanded to cover thousands of square miles of brutal, rugged terrain. Yet, there was nothing. Not a single trace. No car. No clothing. No footprints leading off a trail. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed a bright red 1991 Pontiac Grand Prix and 3 human beings whole. By late February, the mood had shifted dramatically from a rescue mission to a dark, creeping realization. Experienced investigators know that accidents leave signs. A car crash leaves debris. A lost hiker leaves tracks. Nothing leaves nothing. The FBI was called in, bringing with them the full resources of a major federal manhunt. They began to look not just at the cliffs and the river, but at the people. They turned their intense focus to the Cedar Lodge. They processed room 509 with forensic precision. It was pristine. The beds were made. Their luggage was gone. It looked for all the world like they had simply packed up and checked out normally. But there was no record of them checking out at the front desk. No credit card activity after the 15th. No phone calls. It was a locked room mystery in a motel. The FBI began to interview the staff of the Cedar Lodge. It was a transient workforce, often made up of drifters, seasonal workers, people looking to get away from something or someone. It was a motley crew. And among the maintenance men, the housekeepers, and the front desk clerks, agents began to conduct routine interviews. One of the scores of men they spoke to was a quiet, unassuming handyman who had worked at the lodge for over a year. His name was Cary Stayner. He was polite, cooperative, helpful even. He had keys to the rooms as part of his job. He let agents into rooms, answered their questions calmly, and faded into the background. He didn't raise a single red flag. He was just the guy in the background, the one who fixed the toilets and changed the light bulbs. While the FBI was interviewing Stayner and hundreds of others, a separate, chaotic drama was unfolding nearby that would completely derail the investigation for precious weeks. Just miles away from the Cedar Lodge in the rugged foothills lived a loose-knit group of local methamphetamine users. They were known to local law enforcement for petty crimes, violence, and erratic behavior. They were the perfect suspects. Volatile, criminal, and convenient. Investigators, desperate for a lead in a high-profile case with absolutely zero physical evidence, latched onto this group with a ferocious intensity. They began receiving tips from jailhouse informants, tips that would later be proven false, fueled by drug-induced paranoia or desires for the massive reward money that had been offered. These tips claimed that this meth gang had kidnapped the women, that they were holding them hostage in various remote locations, that they had killed them in a botched robbery. For weeks, valuable FBI resources poured into chasing this phantom lead. SWAT teams raided dilapidated trailers in the middle of the night. Dozens of strung-out addicts were hauled in for intense, hours-long interrogations. The media, hungry for a villain in this terrifying story, played up the meth heads in the woods angle. It was a compelling narrative. Innocent, wholesome tourists falling prey to the dark, seedy underbelly of rural poverty. But it was all a mirage. A perfectly timed, accidental smokescreen. While the FBI was kicking down doors looking for meth dealers, the real killer was still waking up every morning, putting on his Cedar Lodge maintenance uniform, and going to work. He was quietly watching the circus from the front row, likely amused by the chaos he had caused. He was hiding in the one place no one was really looking closely, yet in plain sight. On March 18, 1999, a full month after they vanished, the agonizing silence was finally, violently broken. A hiker, deep in the woods near Don Pedro Reservoir, miles away from the primary search grid, stumbled upon a chilling sight. A bright red 1991 Pontiac Grand Prix, hidden deliberately in a dense thicket of pine trees, burned almost to its metal skeleton. It was Carole Sund's rental car. When investigators arrived, the scene was a forensic nightmare. The fire had been intense, a deliberate act of destruction designed to obliterate any trace of DNA or fingerprints. But inside the trunk, amidst the ash and twisted metal, they found the charred remains of two bodies. Dental records would soon confirm the heartbreaking truth that Jens Sund had dreaded. They were Carole Sund and Silvina Pelosso. The discovery shattered the last fragile hopes of an accident. This was murder. Cold, calculated, and brutal. But amidst the horror, a terrifying question emerged, one that haunted every agent on the scene. Where was Juli Sund? Only two bodies were in the trunk. The 15-year-old daughter was missing. Had she been kept alive? Was she still out there? The discovery changed the entire profile of the crime. It proved that the perpetrators hadn't just snatched them in a panic. They had controlled them. Driven the car nearly an hour away from the lodge undetected, murdered two of them, hidden the car with methodical care, and then torched it. This wasn't the disorganized act of tweakers looking for a quick score. This was disciplined. This was planned. Weeks dragged on. The snow melted, revealing only more empty wilderness. Then, in a twist that seemed lifted from a dark Hollywood thriller, a letter arrived at the Stockton FBI field office. It was anonymous, taunting, and terrifyingly specific. It contained a hand-drawn map leading to a remote location near Don Pedro Reservoir, not far from where the car had been found. Following the map's chillingly precise directions, agents hiked into the brush. There, atop a lonely hill, they found the decomposed remains of Juli Sund. She had not been burned in the car. Her throat had been slashed. She had been left exposed to the elements. A final, brutal indignity. The letter was a bombshell. It proved the killer wasn't just a disorganized thug. He was playing a game. He was watching the news, tracking the investigation, and actively mocking law enforcement. He was confident enough, arrogant enough, to send them a map to his own crime scene. Profilers at Quantico went into overdrive. This behavior, the taunting, the need for control, the separation of the youngest victim, pointed to a single, organized sexual sadist, a lone wolf. Yet, incredibly, the investigation's momentum couldn't turn fast enough. The meth gang theory remained the primary public focus. The real killer, Cary Stayner, watched it all, secure in his camouflage of normalcy, waiting for the summer tourist season to begin. While the FBI chased phantom meth gangs through the foothills, Cary Stayner continued to change light bulbs and plunge toilets at the Cedar Lodge. To the agents who occasionally questioned him, he was just another piece of background scenery. A quiet, polite, slightly odd but ultimately harmless handyman. They had no idea they were speaking to a man whose life had been defined, warped, and ultimately destroyed by one of the most famous crimes in American history. Cary Stayner was the older brother of Stephen Stayner. In 1972, when Cary was 11, his 7-year-old brother Stephen was kidnapped by a pedophile named Kenneth Parnell. For 7 agonizing years, the Stayner family lived in the blinding spotlight of a national tragedy. They were the parents of the missing boy. Cary, the older brother, became the invisible child, forgotten in the shadow of his brother's absence. Then, in 1980, a miracle happened. Stephen Stayner escaped, saving another kidnapped boy in the process. He returned home a national hero, the subject of TV movies and endless news coverage. But the miracle didn't fix the family. It broke them completely. The attention remained solely on Stephen. Cary, now a young adult, was pushed even further into the margins. He watched as his brother, traumatized and struggling, became America's golden child, while he himself wrestled with his own dark, burgeoning demons that no one noticed. Psychologists would later theorize that this profound, lifelong feeling of being invisible, of being less than, fueled a volcanic rage in Cary Stayner. He didn't just want attention, he wanted to be God. He wanted the ultimate power of life and death that his brother's kidnapper had wielded. He began to fantasize, not about being a hero, but about being the villain. He drew graphic cartoons of women being tortured. He openly told friends about fantasies of murdering his girlfriend and her daughter. But in the pre-digital age, these red flags remained scattered, unconnected anecdotes in the minds of people who just thought Cary was weird. By 1999, he was living a drifter's existence, eventually landing the maintenance job at Cedar Lodge. It was the perfect hunting ground for a man who craved invisibility. He had a master key. He knew which rooms were occupied by vulnerable women. He knew the cleaning schedules, the shift changes, the blind spots in the security cameras. When he targeted Carole, Juli, and Silvina in room 509, he didn't have to break in. He just used his key. He entered their sanctuary not as an intruder, but as an employee. He later confessed, with chilling, detached detail, to what happened next. He described how he tricked his way into the room under the guise of fixing a leak. Once inside, the mask dropped. He pulled a gun. He bound them with duct tape and rope. He controlled them completely, reveling in the terror he was inflicting, terror that finally made him the most important person in the room. He strangled Carole and Silvina first, putting their bodies in the trunk of their own rental car. But he kept Juli alive. He drove her, alone, to the remote location at Don Pedro Reservoir. He spent hours with her before finally slashing her throat, an act of ultimate, intimate violence that fulfilled his darkest, decades-old fantasies. And then he went back to work. He went to the employee dining room. He ate dinner. He chatted with co-workers about the missing tourists. He even reportedly helped FBI agents when they came to search the grounds, offering helpful suggestions about where someone might hide bodies. He was living out his own twisted version of his brother's story, but this time, he was the one in control. He was the one everyone was looking for. And for 5 long months, as spring turned to summer and the tourists began to flood back into Yosemite, he remained invisible, a monster hiding in plain sight, waiting patiently for his next opportunity to strike. The terror returned in July 1999. As the summer season hit its peak, Yosemite was packed with tourists trying to forget the horrors of the winter. But Cary Stayner hadn't forgotten. His hunger had returned. This time, he didn't target tourists at a motel. He targeted one of the park's own, Joie Armstrong, a 26-year-old naturalist, a beloved educator who taught children about the wonders of Yosemite, was living in an isolated cabin near the park's forest area. She was everything Stayner was not: vibrant, connected to nature, surrounded by friends. On July 21st, Stayner spotted her. He later admitted that he hadn't planned it. It was an impulsive act of opportunity. He followed her to her cabin. Unlike the calculated motel invasion, this was a brutal, chaotic attack in broad daylight. He confronted her. She fought back ferociously. The struggle was immense, a testament to her will to live. But Stayner, fueled by a lifetime of rage, overpowered her. He decapitated her. It was a horrific escalation, an act so brazen and messy that it shattered his invisibility. He had left evidence. He had been seen in the area. His vehicle, an international Scout, was distinctive. When Joie's body was found near her cabin, the park went into total lockdown. This wasn't a missing persons case anymore. It was an active hunt for a monster who was clearly still inside the gates. The FBI, realizing the meth gang theory didn't fit this new crime, finally pivoted. They began looking at everyone who had access, everyone who belonged. And they found tire tracks near Joie's cabin that matched a very specific type of vehicle. Cary Stayner knew his time was up. He didn't wait to be arrested. He fled. He drove his scout out of the park, heading south, perhaps intending to disappear into Mexico. But he didn't make it. He was stopped by police at a nudist resort near Sacramento, a bizarre, almost surreal final location for a man who had spent his life hiding. When news of Cary Stayner's arrest broke, it sent a shockwave through the Yosemite community that was arguably more intense than the initial disappearances. At the Cedar Lodge, employees were stunned into silence. They remembered him as the quiet guy who always showed up for his shifts, who was polite to guests, who had even sickeningly offered comfort to some of them during the height of the search for Carole and Juli. For the FBI agents who had interviewed him months earlier, it was a moment of professional horror. They had looked him in the eye. They had been in the same room with the man who held all the answers, and they had let him walk away to kill again. It was a brutal lesson in the banality of evil. And a monster doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, he just looks like the guy fixing the ice machine. Stayner, once in custody, didn't lawyer up. He didn't deny it. Almost immediately, he began to talk. And he didn't just confess, he bragged. He laid out the details of the crimes with a calm, almost detached precision that terrified even seasoned interrogators. He wanted them to know how smart he had been. He wanted them to know how he had fooled them all. The forgotten child was finally the center of attention, and he was going to make sure the world heard every single word of his story. The interrogation room at the Sacramento FBI field office was small, stark, and airless. Across a simple metal table sat Cary Stayner. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like exactly what he was, a tired, middle-aged maintenance worker in a faded jumpsuit. But as the agents began to speak, a transformation occurred. The quiet, unassuming handyman vanished, replaced by a man eager, desperate even to finally take center stage in his own dark life story. Stayner waived his right to an attorney immediately. He didn't want a lawyer. He wanted an audience. For 30 years, ever since his younger brother Stephen's miraculous return from 7 years of captivity had captivated the nation, Cary had lived in the long, cold shadow of a celebrated tragedy. He was the other brother, the one who hadn't been kidnapped, the one whose pain was always secondary. Now, finally, he was the only person in the room who mattered. He began his confession not with hesitation, but with a chilling, almost professorial level of detail. He took the agents back to the night of February 15th at the Cedar Lodge. He described watching Carole, Juli, and Silvina at dinner. To everyone else, they were a happy family on vacation. To Stayner, they were targets. He described going back to his room, methodically packing his kit. A backpack filled with duct tape, pre-cut lengths of rope, a knife, and an unregistered pistol he kept for just such an occasion. He didn't break into room 509. He didn't need to. He had a master key, a perk of his trusted position, but he didn't even use that. He simply knocked on the door. When Carole answered, he put on his handyman mask. He told them there was a severe leak in the room above them, and he needed to check their bathroom immediately to prevent flooding. It was a brilliant, simple ruse, exploiting the inherent trust that tourists place in uniformed hotel staff. Carole, grateful for the help, let him in. Once the door closed behind him, the mask dropped. He pulled the pistol. He described the look of utter, paralyzing shock on their faces, a look he savored, He was no longer the invisible maintenance man. He was God in that small room. He ordered them to lie on the floor. He bound their hands and feet with the duct tape. He gagged them. He separated them, putting Juli in the bathroom so she couldn't see what he was about to do to her mother and friend. He described strangling Carole first, then Silvina. He didn't rush. He took his time, reveling in the absolute control he finally possessed over life and death. But the most harrowing part of his confession, the part that even hardened FBI agents struggled to listen to without flinching, concerned 15-year-old Juli Sund. He hadn't killed her at the lodge. He had a different plan for her. He described, with zero visible emotion, how he wrapped the bodies of Carole and Silvina in blankets and carried them out to the trunk of their red Pontiac Grand Prix, right in the parking lot, under the glare of the motel security lights. No one noticed. He then detailed the murder of Joie Armstrong in July. This was different, he said. It wasn't planned. He saw her near her isolated cabin in Foresta. An impulse overtook him. He tried to subdue her, but Joie, a strong, capable naturalist who spent her life in the outdoors, fought back ferociously. The struggle was immense. Stayner, fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage, finally overpowered her. He decapitated her, a brutal, messy act that shattered his carefully maintained pattern and ultimately led to his capture. He described it all without a single tear, a single tremor in his voice. It was just data, facts from a life he finally felt was important. He then went back for Juli. He forced her into the front passenger seat of the car, right next to him. He drove out of the Cedar Lodge lot, waving to the night clerk as he left. A trusted employee, supposedly running an errand. He drove for nearly an hour through the pitch-black, winding mountain roads to Don Pedro Reservoir. During that drive with her mother's body in the trunk, Stayner claimed he talked to Juli. He engaged in a delusional, twisted fantasy that they were connecting, that she understood him. At the reservoir, the fantasy ended. He described leading her to the top of a lonely, scrub-covered hill. He didn't just kill her, he butchered her. He slashed her throat so violently that she was nearly decapitated. He then left her there, a broken doll discarded in the wilderness, and drove the car a few miles away to torch it, destroying the evidence of the other two murders. He then hiked miles back to a main road in the freezing winter night, hitchhiked back to El Porto, snuck back into his room, showered, and went to sleep. The next morning, he went to work. He plunged toilets. He changed sheets. He lived among the frantic families and search teams for 5 months, a perfect predator hiding in the flock. As Stayner talked, the FBI agents began to see the terrifying architecture of his mind. He wasn't just recounting facts, he was justifying a lifetime of perceived slights. He spoke about voices in his head, demons that had commanded him to kill since he was 7 years old. Coincidentally, the exact age his brother Stephen was when he was kidnapped. He claimed these voices had been dormant for years, only to be reawakened by the sight of Carole Sund, whom he said reminded him of women who had rejected him in the past. Psychiatrists would later tear this insanity, defense apart. They saw a classic narcissist, a man who used feigned mental illness as a shield for his own deep-seated inadequacy and rage against women. He hadn't killed because voices told him to do so. He killed because it made him feel powerful. He killed because for those few hours in room 509 and on that lonely hill by the reservoir, he was the most important person in the world, not his famous brother. He described in chilling detail how he had revisited the crime scenes in his mind over the 5 months he was free. He admitted to feeling a sense of supreme accomplishment every time he saw a missing flyer with their faces on it. He knew something the entire world wanted to know, and that secret was his ultimate source of power. He was the puppeteer, and the FBI, the media, and the grieving families were all just dancing on his string. Stayner didn't just provide a narrative, he provided the forensic keys that unlocked the entire case. He told investigators exactly where to find the knife he had used to kill Juli Sund. It was buried in a specific spot near the Cedar Lodge employee housing. When agents dug there, they found it, right where he said it would be. He described the specific brand of duct tape he had used, tape that matched residues found on the victim's clothing. He drew diagrams of the positioning of the bodies in the trunk of the rental car that matched crime scene photos perfectly, details that had never been released to the press. For the families of Carole, Juli, Silvina, and Joie, these details were a final, crushing blow. They had lived for months in a state of agonizing ambiguity, fueled by false leads and media speculation. Now, they had absolute, horrific clarity. Their loved ones hadn't just died, they had been hunted, terrorized, and butchered by a man they might have tipped for carrying their bags. The betrayal was total. The safe space of the national park had been irrevocably corrupted by a single man's monstrous need for validation. The physical evidence, once Stayner pointed the way, was overwhelming. A search of his room at the employee housing complex uncovered a treasure trove of damning items. They found the backpack he had used as his kill kit. Inside, they found rolls of duct tape that matched the tape used on the victims. They found rope identical to the ligatures. And, most critically, they found a handgun, a Ruger .22 caliber pistol, hidden in a bag of cement mixed wool. Ballistics tests would later confirm it was the weapon he had brandished in room 509 to gain initial control. Stayner didn't stop confessing. He seemed almost eager to prove his intelligence to the agents. He drew detailed maps of the crime scenes from memory, maps that matched the locations perfectly, down to the placement of specific trees and rocks. He described the weather on the nights of the murders, the exact route he drove, even the music that was playing on the radio. It was a performance, a final act of supreme narcissism from a man who had spent his life feeling ignored. He had finally forced the world to pay attention. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they ordered a battery of deep psychological evaluations. What the psychiatrists found was a terrifying, decades-long roadmap of a developing serial killer. Stayner hadn't just snapped in 1999. He had been rehearsing for 30 years. They found childhood notebooks filled with graphic, disturbing drawings of women being bound, tortured, and decapitated. These weren't just idle doodles, they were blueprints. He admitted to practicing his techniques on animals as a teenager, a classic, chilling precursor to human violence. He spoke of an intense, uncontrollable urge to kill that had been building since puberty, an urge he called the beast. The forgotten brother narrative, while true, was only part of the story. The experts concluded that Cary Stayner was a sexual sadist who would likely have killed regardless of his brother's fame. The tragedy of Stephen Stayner didn't create the monster. It just gave the monster a convenient mask to wear. The forensic evidence found in Stayner's room at the Cedar Lodge employee housing was a roadmap of his depravity. In addition to the gun and the kill kit, agents found a staggering collection of disturbing items. There were maps of Yosemite with specific remote locations circled, locations that perfectly matched where the bodies had been found. There were handwritten notes, detailed timelines of his movements on the nights of the murders, almost as if he were keeping a perverse diary of his crimes. Most damning of all, they found direct links to Joie Armstrong. Hidden deep in his closet, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a bloody shirt. DNA testing would later confirm the blood belonged to Joie. They also found a pair of boots with mud and pine needles embedded in the treads. Forensic analysis matched the soil exactly to the area around Joie's cabin. Stayner hadn't just confessed, he had kept trophies. As the physical evidence mounted, the task of the prosecution shifted from proving who did it to understanding why. In preparation for the inevitable insanity defense, they began to interview everyone who had known him at the Cedar Lodge. The picture that emerged was chilling. He wasn't a raving lunatic. He was the quiet guy who helped carry groceries. He was the man who had comforted a terrified housekeeper just days after the Sunds disappeared, telling her, "Don't worry, you're safe here." He was a master of compartmentalization, a man who could murder 3 women one night and then earnestly discuss fixing a leaky sink the next morning. Perhaps the most surreal moment of the entire investigation came not in an interrogation room, but on national television. In a move that stunned his own defense team, Stayner agreed to a jailhouse interview with a TV reporter. Calmly, almost casually, he looked into the camera and confessed to all 4 murders. He described the crimes with a detached, almost bored demeanor, as if he were recounting a grocery list. He claimed he wished he had been caught sooner, that he had tried to leave clues. It was a final, devastating act of narcissism. He wanted to make sure the world knew exactly what he had done, and that he, the forgotten brother, was now unforgettable. This public confession effectively ended any chance of a traditional defense. The trial would not be about guilt or innocence. It would be entirely about his mental state. Was he a cold-blooded, calculating sexual sadist who deserved to die? Or was he a broken man, driven insane by a childhood tragedy that was not his fault? The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would force a grieving nation to re-examine the long shadow of the Stayner family tragedy. For the seasoned FBI agents and detectives who sat across the table from him, Cary Stayner was unlike any killer they had ever encountered. Most criminals deny, deflect, or show some flicker of emotion, anger, fear, even remorse. Stayner showed nothing. He recounted the butchery of 4 human beings with the same flat, dispassionate tone he might use to describe fixing a leaky faucet. One agent later described the experience as staring into a void. There was no humanity behind his eyes, only a cold, calculating intelligence that seemed to derive pleasure from their obvious horror. He would pause in his gruesome narrative to ask for a soda or to make a mundane observation about the weather, before diving right back into the details of the strangulations. It was a chilling performance of utter psychopathy. The man who had completely divorced himself from the moral universe. The toll on the investigators was immense. They had to maintain a professional rapport to keep him talking, to get every last detail for the families, all while sitting inches away from a man who represented the darkest potential of the human soul. They knew they were listening to a monster, but they had to treat him like a witness to his own crimes. With his confession complete, Cary Stayner was transferred to federal custody. The case had become a national spectacle, a grim real-life horror movie playing out on the nightly news. The Yosemite killer was no longer a faceless phantom. He was a known entity. The man whose face was plastered on every newspaper in the country. The legal battle that followed would not be about guilt or innocence. His confession had ensured that. It would be about life or death. Stayner's defense team would argue that he was insane, a broken man driven by forces beyond his control. The prosecution would argue that he was a cold-blooded, calculating sexual sadist who deserved the ultimate punishment. The stage was set for a trial that would force the nation to confront the terrifying reality that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones we invite into our rooms. The legal reckoning for Cary Stayner was so sprawling, so poisoned by pretrial publicity, that it had to be bifurcated, not just into 2 separate trials, but moved across the state of California. The first trial, in federal court for the murder of Joie Armstrong on federal park land, ended relatively quickly with a guilty plea in exchange for a life sentence. A calculated move by his defense team to avoid one death penalty while they prepared for the main event. The second trial, for the brutal Cedar Lodge murders of Carole, Juli, and Silvina, was a different beast entirely. Moved to Santa Clara County in San Jose to find an untainted jury, it became a grim spectacle, a traveling circus of horror that drew national media, true crime devotees, and the shattered families of the victims who had traveled thousands of miles to witness justice. When the trial finally began in 2002, 3 years after the crimes, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was suffocatingly tense. Cary Stayner was paraded in, but he was unrecognizable. Gone was the scruffy blue-collar handyman in the jumpsuit. He had been scrubbed clean by his defense team. He was clean-shaven, wearing expensive-looking spectacles and conservative, ill-fitting suits. He looked like a mild-mannered accountant or a librarian. A deliberate visual strategy designed to make it as hard as possible for the jury to connect this quiet man with the monster described in the indictment. The prosecution, led by seasoned district attorneys who knew they were fighting against the insanity narrative, opened with a hammer blow. They didn't just promise to prove he did it. Stayner had already confessed. They promised to prove why. They argued, with meticulous, chilling precision, that Cary Stayner was the antithesis of insane. He was, they contended, a textbook sexual sadist who suffered from no break with reality. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned it with cold, rational calculation, and he derived supreme conscious pleasure from the acts themselves. They didn't just use words. They used his own preparations against him. They brought out the kill kit found in his room. They laid out the items for the jury: the duct tape, the pre-measured lengths of rope, the gun, the newly sharpened knife. They argued that an insane man in the grip of a psychotic break does not pack a bag weeks in advance. An insane man doesn't wait patiently for 5 months between his first triple homicide and his next attack, working a normal job, interacting lucidly with FBI agents, and biding his time until the summer tourist season brought fresh victims. A calculated predator does. They highlighted his terrifying ability to compartmentalize, to murder 3 women in room 509 one night, and then calmly fix a guest's clogged toilet with a smile the very next morning. This wasn't madness, they argued. It was supreme, chilling control. The defense, led by Marcia Morrissey, who had previously defended O.J. Simpson, had an almost impossible task. With the physical evidence insurmountable and the confession taped, their only viable path was the insanity defense. They had to convince a jury that Stayner was so broken by his past that he could not distinguish right from wrong. They turned the courtroom into a tragic theater of the Stayner family history. They called expert psychiatrists who detailed Cary's childhood in the shadow of his brother Stephen's kidnapping. They painted a picture of a boy who was emotionally abandoned by parents consumed by grief. A boy who learned that the only way to get attention was to be a victim or a victimizer. They introduced evidence of his obsessive-compulsive disorders, his strange eating habits, eating odd concoctions like jars of peanut butter mixed with strange items, and his burgeoning violent fantasies that began in puberty. They argued he was a prisoner of a corrupted brain, driven by voices and compulsions he was powerless to resist. But the prosecution countered with their own heavyweights, including the renowned forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, who had evaluated Jeffrey Dahmer and the Unabomber. Dietz tore the insanity defense to shreds. He pointed out Stayner's highly organized behavior, the way he successfully hid the bodies, the way he cleaned up the crime scenes, the way he lied to the FBI for months. These, Dietz argued, were not the actions of a man who didn't know right from wrong. They were the actions of a man who knew exactly that what he was doing was wrong and actively sought to avoid punishment. The most devastating moment of the trial, however, wasn't an expert's testimony. It was Stayner's own voice. The prosecution played the full, unedited tapes of his FBI confession for the jury. In that cold, flat, utterly emotionless monotone, the jurors heard him describe the murders, not with the chaotic raving of a madman, but with the precise, almost bored detail of a man recounting a mundane day at work. He talked about the rush of power he felt when he pulled the gun. He described eating dinner at a local diner after burning the bodies of Carole and Silvina, casually noting to the agents that he was pretty hungry after all the physical exertion of digging graves and hiking. This callousness, this absolute void where a human conscience should be, chilled the jurors to the bone more effectively than any gruesome crime scene photo. After weeks of grueling, often tearful testimony, the jury's decision in the guilt phase was swift. They found Cary Stayner guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances of multiple murder and lying in wait. The sanity phase was even shorter. They quickly rejected the defense's arguments and found him legally sane. The final phase was the penalty phase. Life in prison or death by lethal injection. It was here that the true human cost of Stayner's crimes was finally given center stage. The families of Carole, Juli, and Silvina took the stand to deliver victim impact statements. Jolie Sund, a man broken by the loss of his wife and daughter, spoke of the silent house he now lived in, the future grandchildren he would never hold. Carole Carrington, Carole Sund's mother, spoke of the gaping hole left in their family fabric. They didn't just speak of loss. They spoke of the brutality of how they were lost. They forced the jury to look at Stayner, to see the man who had strangled the life out of 3 vibrant women for nothing more than a fleeting sense of power. In August 2002, the jury returned their final decision. They recommended the death penalty. When the judge formally sentenced him to die, the courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for some reaction from the man who had caused so much pain. Stayner showed nothing. He didn't protest. He didn't cry. He didn't look at the grieving families. He simply sat there, the same beige, unremarkable ghost he had always been, now officially condemned to die by the society he had terrorized from the shadows. Outside the Santa Clara County Courthouse, the scene was a stark contrast to the somber proceedings inside. It was a media frenzy not seen since the O.J. Simpson trial. Satellite trucks from every major news network lined the streets, their dishes pointed skyward like a forest of accusing fingers. Reporters jostled for position, desperate for any scrap of new information. Any reaction from the families as they entered and exited the building each day. The story had everything the 24-hour news cycle craved. A beautiful national park, missing tourists, a gruesome discovery, and a killer with a bizarre, made-for-TV backstory involving his famous brother. True crime authors, sensing a bestseller, packed the gallery, scribbling furiously in notebooks, already planning the titles of their definitive accounts. The tragedy of the Sund and Pelosso families had been commodified, turned into infotainment for a captivated nation. For the jurors, sequestered in a local hotel, cut off from their families and the news, this pressure cooker was invisible but deeply felt. They knew they were at the center of a national storm. They were regular citizens, teachers, mechanics, retirees suddenly tasked with staring directly into the face of pure evil for 8 hours a day. The psychological toll was immense. Several jurors later reported nightmares, sleepless nights, and a profound lingering trauma from viewing the crime scene photos that the rest of the world only read about. They were the silent, secondary victims of Stayner's crimes, forced to bear witness to the darkest depths of human depravity. Before the final verdict, there was one more piece of testimony that sealed Stayner's fate in the minds of many. It didn't come from a psychiatrist or a forensic expert. It came from a fellow inmate. A jailhouse informant took the stand to recount conversations he'd had with Stayner while awaiting trial. He testified that Stayner felt no remorse, only a twisted kind of pride. He claimed Stayner had joked about the murders, referred to his victims in derogatory terms, and even fantasized about escaping to kill again. He reportedly told the informant that his only regret was that he hadn't been able to have more fun with Juli Sund before he had to kill her. While jailhouse informant testimony is often viewed with skepticism, this aligned perfectly with the cold, arrogant persona Stayner had displayed in his EI confession tapes. It reinforced the prosecution's narrative of a man who was not a confused victim of mental illness, but a calculating predator who enjoyed his work. It was the final nail in the coffin of the insanity defense. When the jury finally retreated to deliberate his fate, the image they carried wasn't the broken brother of Stephen Stayner. It was the smirking man who wished he had had more fun with a terrified 15-year-old girl. The sentencing of Cary Stayner in 2002 brought a legal conclusion to the nightmare, but it did not and could not bring peace. For Yosemite National Park, the scars of 1999 were deep, permanent, and fundamentally transformative. The illusion of the park as a pristine, inviolable sanctuary, a place where the evils of the modern world could not reach, had been shattered forever. In the immediate aftermath of the crimes, a pall of fear hung over the valley. Tourism plummeted. The campgrounds, usually teeming with families in the summer months, were eerily quiet. Visitors who did come reported a changed atmosphere, a new, harder-edged vigilance. The carefree trust that had defined the park experience was gone, replaced by suspicion. Every solo hiker was now a potential victim. Every friendly maintenance worker was now a potential threat. The National Park Service was forced to confront a horrifying reality. Their own vetting procedures had failed catastrophically. How had a man with Stayner's known history of mental instability, drug use, and a criminal record, however minor, been allowed to work in a position of such absolute trust, with a master key to the rooms of thousands of tourists? The investigation revealed that background checks for seasonal concessionaire employees were often minimal, sometimes nothing more than a cursory glance at recent local records. Stayner had slipped through the massive cracks of a system designed for speed and low cost, not security. For the families of Carole, Juli, Silvina, and Joie, the aftermath was not a historical period. It was a life sentence of grief. Juli Sund, who had lost his wife and daughter in a single night, returned to a silent home in Eureka. He became a tireless, vocal advocate for victims' rights, channeling his unimaginable pain into a crusade to ensure that other families would not have to endure the same agonizing delays, false leads, and jurisdictional squabbles that had plagued the initial search for his family. The Pelosso family, who had sent their vibrant daughter to America for a dream vacation, only to have her returned in a casket, retreated into a private, devastating sorrow back in Argentina, their faith in the safety of the United States forever broken. The Cedar Lodge itself tried to move on, but the shadow of room 509 lingered like a physical presence. It became a macabre landmark. Some tourists would specifically request not to stay in that wing of the motel, terrified by its history. Others, drawn by a darker curiosity, would specifically ask for it. Eventually, motel management changed the room number, a cosmetic attempt to erase a permanent stain. But the memory remained. Cary Stayner was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row. He has sat there for over 2 decades, a forgotten man in a concrete cell, while the world outside has moved on. He has exhausted most of his appeals, but California's moratorium on executions means he will likely die of old age before he ever faces the lethal injection he was sentenced to. He occasionally gives interviews to journalists, still trying to control the narrative, still trying to blame his brother's kidnapping for his own monstrous choices. But few listen anymore. The forgotten brother has, in the end, been forgotten again. His crimes remembered, but his name slowly fading into the grim roll call of American serial killers. While Stayner sat on death row, the legal battle shifted from criminal court to civil court. The families of the victims, particularly Juli Sund and the Pelossos, were determined to hold the institutions accountable for the systemic failures that had allowed a predator to operate unchecked. They filed wrongful death lawsuits against the motel's management company and other entities responsible for operations at El Portal. The discovery phase of these lawsuits was revelatory. It exposed a startling lack of rigorous background checks for seasonal and maintenance employees working in and around the national park. In the rush to staff the busy tourist season, standard vetting procedures had often been rushed or cursory. Stayner's history of minor drug offenses and his known connection to the high-profile Silvina Pelosso kidnapping case, while not inherently disqualifying, should have raised red flags for a position that granted unsupervised access to guest rooms. The lawsuits argued that the lodge had a fundamental duty of care to its guests, a duty that was breached the moment Cary Stayner was handed a master key. Though the lawsuits were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed sums, their impact was profound. They forced a quiet but significant overhaul of hiring practices for concessionaires operating on federal land. Background checks became more rigorous, often requiring FBI fingerprinting for any employee with access to guest areas. The trust that had characterized park employment for decades was replaced by a necessary, if regrettable, layer of bureaucratic vigilance. Security within Yosemite Valley itself also tightened. The number of law enforcement rangers was increased. Surveillance cameras, once seen as anathema to the wilderness experience, began to appear in parking lots near trailheads and in lodge common areas. The park was forced to acknowledge a painful new reality. It was no longer just a refuge from the modern world. It was a part of it, subject to the same dangers and requiring the same defenses. The trauma of the Yosemite murders was not confined to the victims' families. It radiated outward, deeply affecting the men and women tasked with investigating the crimes. For the park rangers who first responded to the missing persons report, Yosemite was their home, their sanctuary. To have it violated so brutally felt like a personal assault. Veteran FBI agents, accustomed to the darkest aspects of human nature, were profoundly shaken by the discoveries at Don Pedro Reservoir. The sight of the burned car, the condition of the bodies in the trunk, and later the sheer callousness of finding Juli Sund left alone on a desolate hill, left indelible marks on their psyches. Many of the investigators who worked the case later spoke of it as the one that haunted them most, the one that shattered their professional detachment. They had walked the same trails, stayed in similar lodges, and the realization that the monster they were hunting was not an outsider, but a fixture of the park's daily life, was a deeply unsettling breach of their own sense of security. Beyond the park boundaries, in the small gateway communities of El Portal, Mariposa, and Oakhurst, the impact was immediate and economically devastating. These towns exist almost entirely to serve the millions of tourists who pass through them on their way to Yosemite. In the spring and summer of 1999, as news of the murders dominated national headlines, the tourists simply stopped coming. Hotel bookings evaporated. Restaurants sat empty. Souvenir shops, usually bustling with families buying t-shirts and postcards, were silent. The fear that had gripped the nation had a tangible, crushing financial cost for the locals, many of whom had known Cary Stayner as a neighbor or a regular customer. They were victims of a different sort, their livelihoods held hostage by the actions of one man. The silent aftermath was not just the absence of laughter in the campgrounds. It was the silence of a local economy grinding to a terrified halt, waiting for a sense of safety that would take years to fully return. The psychological scars extended deep into the tight-knit community of park employees. For years, seasonal workers had lived in a kind of shared, unspoken fellowship, bonded by their love for the wilderness. Cary Stayner broke that bond forever. Many employees who had worked alongside him at the Cedar Lodge struggled with profound guilt and confusion. They replayed every mundane interaction, every shared coffee break, searching desperately for the red flags they had missed. How could they have laughed with a man who was, at that very moment, likely planning his next kill? The betrayal fostered a lingering atmosphere of distrust in employee housing areas. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted. The innocence of the summer job in Yosemite was gone, replaced by the chilling knowledge that the person sleeping in the next bunk might be wearing a mask. To truly understand the monster that Cary Stayner became, we must look back not just to 1999, but to 1972, to the defining trauma that shattered his family and perhaps sealed his fate. Cary was 11 years old when his 7-year-old brother, Stephen Stayner, vanished while walking home from school in Merced, California. A kidnapping that would eventually become one of the most famous in American history. For the next 7 agonizing years, the Stayner home in Merced didn't just grieve, it became a shrine to the missing boy. Every conversation, every prayer, every waking moment was focused on Stephen. Cary, the older brother who had failed to protect him, was pushed to the absolute periphery of his own family. He became the lucky one, the one who hadn't been taken and therefore the one who needed less attention. He grew up in a house where grief was the only currency that mattered, and he had none to spend. He later described feeling invisible in his own home, a ghost haunting the edges of his parents' obsession with his missing brother. Then, in 1980, the miracle happened. Stephen escaped his captor, Kenneth Parnell, walking into a police station nearly 200 miles away, holding the hand of another kidnapped boy, 5-year-old Timmy White, whom he had rescued. It was a story made for Hollywood. Stephen returned home a national hero. The media descended on the Stayner home in a frenzy. There were TV movies, endless interviews, parades. But amidst the celebration, a darker dynamic was taking root. Cary Stayner watched as his brother, now a deeply traumatized teenager himself, was showered with the love, attention, and validation that Cary had craved his entire life. He watched as his parents, overwhelmed with joy and guilt, focused entirely on Stephen's difficult reintegration. Cary was once again the invisible son, now living in the shadow not of a tragedy, but of a living legend. Psychologists who later examined Cary pointed to this specific period, the early 1980s, following Stephen's return, as the crucible of his pathology. His feelings of inadequacy didn't just fester. They metastasized into a volcanic, murderous jealousy. He didn't just want attention, he wanted to be Stephen. He wanted the raw power that Stephen commanded. The power to stop the world, to make everyone look at you, to be the center of a national narrative. And in his twisted, developing mind, he began to realize that the only way to get that kind of attention, the only way to eclipse a hero, was to become the villain in someone else's story. While Stephen struggled to readjust to normal life, tragically dying in a motorcycle accident in 1989, a final cruel twist of fate that left the family shattered once again. Cary's dark fantasies began to take concrete shape. He later admitted to psychiatrists that during this period, while the world was mourning his brother, he was fantasizing about capturing women. He drew graphic cartoons of bondage and torture, hiding them in his room. He confessed to a profound feeling of powerlessness that could only be assuaged by complete, God-like dominance over another human being. When he finally acted on these urges in 1999, 20 years after Stephen's return and a decade after his death, it was no coincidence that he chose a location, Yosemite National Park, that guaranteed maximum national attention. He wasn't just killing in the shadows, he was creating his own headline. He was finally stepping out of Stephen's shadow, not as a hero, but as the ultimate anti-hero. In his warped mind, the fame he achieved as the Yosemite Killer, the fear he inspired in millions, was the validation he had been denied his entire life. He had finally become the most important Stayner brother. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Cary Stayner didn't just exist in the background. He left a distinct, escalating trail of red flags that, in hindsight, seemed blindingly tragically obvious. He wasn't just a quiet introvert. He was a man losing control. He was arrested in 1997 for possession of marijuana and methamphetamine. In the rough and tumble world of seasonal labor, these charges were often overlooked, treated by the courts as minor nuisances, rather than warning signs of a deeper, spiraling instability. He was known among co-workers to have a hair-trigger temper, occasionally exploding into disproportionate rages over minor slights, a misplaced tool, a wrong food order, only to quickly retreat back into his shell of quiet normalcy. Friends and former girlfriends later recalled deeply disturbing, specific conversations that they had dismissed at the time as dark humor or strange quirks. He once told a girlfriend, in graphic, chilling detail, about a recurring dream he had of murdering her and her young daughter, describing exactly how he would bind them and silence them. He spoke with an unsettling fascination about the Zodiac Killer and the Hillside Stranglers, not with fear, but with a kind of professional admiration for their ability to evade capture. Yet, all these incidents were constantly viewed through the warped prism of the Stayner family tragedy. He wasn't seen by his community as a burgeoning sexual sadist. He was seen as Stephen's poor, weird older brother, a damaged soul who deserved pity, patience, and understanding, not suspicion. The immense shadow of his brother's kidnapping didn't just warp Cary's mind. It warped the perceptions of everyone around him, effectively blinding them to the lethal danger he was becoming. When he applied for the maintenance job at Cedar Lodge in 1997, this blindness became systemic. His background check was cursory at best, a standard, low-level screening designed for seasonal workers, not for someone who would be given unrestricted access to sleeping families. The minor drug arrests didn't automatically disqualify him. The deeper psychological cracks, the violent fantasies, the obsession with control, the admitted voices, were invisible to a standard employment form. He was hired, given a uniform that conferred immediate, unquestioned trust to guests, and handed the master key that would eventually open the door to room 509. He was a wolf welcomed into the fold, not because he was a master of disguise, but because everyone was too focused on the tragedy of the past to see the horror standing right in front of them. The months leading up to February 1999 were not a period of dormancy for Cary Stayner. They were a terrifying, active dress rehearsal for mass murder. In his later confessions to the FBI, he detailed multiple practice runs that never made the news because they stopped just short of death. He described, with chilling specificity, how he would stalk lone women on the hiking trails near the lodge, watching them through the scope of a high-powered rifle from a hidden vantage point, testing his nerve, feeling the intoxicating, god-like rush of holding a human life in his hands without pulling the trigger. He admitted to using his master key to enter guest rooms while the occupants were out hiking. He wouldn't steal valuables. Instead, he would exist in their private space, touching their personal belongings, lying on their beds, fantasizing about what he could do if they returned unexpectedly. These were the calculated actions of a predator testing the perimeter fence, methodically looking for weaknesses in the system. He learned exactly which doors in the complex were routinely left unlocked by careless staff, which windows could be easily pried open from the outside without noise, and exactly how long it took for a maid to clean a room, giving him precise windows of opportunity. He was gathering intelligence, refining his methodology, and building up the psychological courage to cross the final line. When Carole, Juli, and Silvina checked into room 509 on that cold February afternoon, they weren't just unlucky tourists in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were walking into a lethal trap that had been meticulously set over 2 years of silent, invisible preparation. The tipping point came in early 1999. Stayner later hinted to psychiatrists that a rejection from a woman he was interested in, combined with the looming anniversary of his brother's escape, created a perfect storm of rage and inadequacy. He felt invisible again, a ghost in his own life. He needed to do something that would make him real, something that would force the world to see him. By mid-February, the pressure inside him was uncontainable. He was no longer just fantasizing. He was actively hunting. He began spending more time in the guest areas of the lodge, watching the new arrivals, looking for the perfect targets, women who were alone or in small groups, women who wouldn't be immediately missed by a husband or boyfriend in the next room. When Carole, Juli, and Silvina checked in, they were just three faces in the crowd to everyone else. To Cary Stayner, they were the answer to a lifetime of dark prayers. The most chilling aspect of Stayner's plain-sight camouflage was his direct interaction with his future victims. He wasn't just watching them from a distance, he was serving them. Witnesses later placed him in the Cedar House restaurant on the evening of February 15th, the same night Carole, Juli, and Silvina ate their final meal. He may have refilled their water glasses, cleared their plates, or simply offered a polite nod as he walked by their table. He later admitted that he had spoken to them briefly in the days leading up to the murders, perhaps offering advice on hiking trails or commenting on the weather. These mundane, forgettable interactions were, for Stayner, a crucial part of the ritual. He was marking them, testing their defenses, ensuring they saw him only as a helpful employee, a non-threat. By embedding himself in their vacation routine, he ensured that when he finally knocked on their door that night, they wouldn't hesitate to open it. He wasn't a stranger. He was just the nice man from the restaurant. The revelation that the killer was the handyman sent a wave of retroactive terror through thousands of people who had stayed at the Cedar Lodge during Stayner's employment. In the weeks following his arrest, the FBI was inundated with calls from former guests. They all had similar chilling stories. They remembered the quiet maintenance man who had fixed their heater, brought them extra towels, or simply smiled at them in the hallway. For these people, the horror wasn't just what happened. It was what could have happened. Every one of them realized they had slept in a room to which a serial killer had a key. They had let their children play near him. They had been unknowingly assessed, judged, and for whatever reason, spared by a man who was actively hunting them. This collective trauma shattered the illusion of the tourist bubble. The idea that when you are on vacation, in a beautiful place, the normal rules of danger don't apply. Cary Stayner proved that the most dangerous predators don't need to break in. Sometimes we invite them in. While Cary Stayner's individual pathology was the direct cause of 4 brutal deaths, a broader, systemic failure paved the way for his crimes. The central question that haunted the victims' families, and indeed the entire nation, was simple but devastating. How was a man with Stayner's known history, his mental instability, his drug use, his connection to a famous kidnapping case, allowed to work in a position of absolute trust, armed with a master key to the rooms of thousands of unsuspecting tourists? The answer lay in the relaxed, almost negligent hiring practices that were standard for seasonal workers in national parks at the time. The Cedar Lodge, like many concessionaires operating in and around federal land, relied heavily on a transient workforce. Background checks were often minimal, sometimes nothing more than a cursory glance at recent local records. Stayner's deeper history, his psychiatric hospitalizations, his obsession with his brother's case, his previous arrests for drug possession in other jurisdictions, slipped easily through the massive cracks of a system designed for speed and low cost, not security. Jolie Sund and the Pelosso family, refusing to let this systemic failure stand, filed wrongful death lawsuits. They didn't just sue Stayner. They sued the lodge and the property management company. They argued that the lodge had a fundamental legal and moral duty to protect its guests, a duty it breached the moment it handed a master key to an unvetted predator. These lawsuits, though eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, forced a painful reckoning within the hospitality industry operating on federal land. They exposed the dangerous gap between the public's perception of safety in a national park and the terrifying reality of who was actually holding the keys to their rooms at night. The legacy of this failure reached all the way to Washington, D.C. The Yosemite murders became a grisly catalyst for tightening federal laws regarding background checks on public lands. While the Crime Control Act of 1990 had mandated checks for federal employees, huge loopholes existed for private contractors and concessionaires operating within national parks. In the wake of Stayner's crimes, those loopholes began to close. New, stricter protocols were implemented across the national park system. FBI fingerprint checks became standard for anyone, even seasonal maintenance workers or housekeepers, who would have unsupervised access to guest areas or keys. The honor system that had characterized park employment for decades was replaced by a necessary, if regrettable, layer of bureaucratic vigilance. It was a change bought with blood, a permanent acknowledgement that the wilderness was no longer just a refuge from the modern world, but a part of it, subject to the same dangers and requiring the same defenses. When the satellite trucks finally packed up and left El Portal, and the national media moved on to the next breaking tragedy, the families of Carole, Juli, and Silvina were left alone with a silence far heavier than the winter snow that had first hidden their loved ones. They faced a choice that confronts every family touched by such profound violence: collapse under the crushing weight of their grief, or find a way to transmute that pain into something enduring. Carole's parents, Francis and Carole Carrington, along with Juli Sund, made a relentless choice. They decided to weaponize their loss against the very kind of darkness that had taken their family. During the agonizing weeks of the initial search, they had learned a brutal, pragmatic lesson about the American justice system. Money moves mountains. The massive reward they had offered had kept their case on the front pages, generated thousands of tips, and maintained FBI engagement when it might otherwise have waned. But they also realized a horrifying truth: most families don't have that option. They saw the systemic disparity, how missing persons cases involving adults, minorities, or those from lower income backgrounds often went cold within days because law enforcement lacked the budget for significant rewards and the media lacked the interest. They saw that justice too often was a luxury good. So, they established the Carole Sund Carrington Memorial Reward Foundation. This wasn't just a passive memorial. It was an active, crime-fighting organization born from their deepest pain. For decades now, this foundation has provided crucial reward money, logistical support, and media attention to hundreds of other families with missing loved ones, often jump-starting cold investigations that police had long since given up on. In a profound final act of defiance against Cary Stayner, Carole Sund's legacy became one of finding the lost. It ensured that other predators hiding in plain sight might be exposed by the very tool, a cash reward that had helped keep the pressure on her own case. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Cordoba, Argentina, the Pelosso family faced a different kind of enduring nightmare. They had sent their vibrant, adventurous daughter Silvina to the United States, believing implicitly in the safety of America, and specifically the sanctity of its national park. To have her returned in a casket, a victim of a uniquely American kind of monster, shattered not just a family, but a community's faith in the idea of safe travel. Their grief is a stark reminder that the tendrils of this crime reached far beyond the borders of California, leaving scars that cross continents. Yosemite remains one of the most staggeringly beautiful places on Earth. The waterfalls still thunder in the spring thaw. The granite cliffs of Half Dome still catch the last golden light of sunset. But for those who know this dark history, the park will always carry a long, cold shadow. It is a permanent reminder that there is no such thing as absolute safety. It is a lesson written in blood that even in our most sacred sanctuaries, we must remain vigilant. Cary Stayner proved that the most dangerous predators don't always live in the dark caves of the wilderness. Sometimes they have a master key, a name tag, and a polite smile. They hide not in the woods, but in the very structures we build for our own comfort. He was a monster who didn't need to break in. He was already inside. We are deep into our journey through these dark territories. If this deep dive into the nightmare of Yosemite has opened your eyes to the hidden dangers of our most cherished places, please support our ongoing investigations by liking this video. We want to hear from you in the comments below. What aspect of this case haunts you the most? Was it the initial meth gang red herring? The terrifying simplicity of Stayner's ruse at the motel door? Or the tragic, twisted connection to his brother Stephen's famous kidnapping? Let us know your thoughts. And finally, to ensure you never miss a briefing, to be the first to know when we open the next classified file, please subscribe to Plain Sight Docs. Most importantly, activate that notification bell. The road is long, the woods are deep, and there are many more stories waiting in the dark. Thank you for watching. Travel safe, trust your instincts, and always check the lock on your door.